There is a gap between them that has deepened with years of miscommunication and avoidance. I could feel that Sybil was projecting onto her daughter. This does happen with older age. And while I found it to be realistic, I didn't think it necessarily helped in creating a more sympathetic character. If you're going to get stuck in the head of a narrator for all the book, it better be a fascinating character. Hello and welcome to Wrapped in Books. My name is Pega, I'm an author, and today I'm going to be reviewing The Correspondent by Virginia Evans. It is a very hot day today, but I did have a bird head wrap and I decided to wear it for today's video to match the vibe. I don't know if you can see the birds actually, hope you can. Anyways, this is Miss Evans' newest novel and the first novel I've read by her. It has been highly popular for quite some time now. People online have been praising this book for its unique style. That seems to be something that a lot of people agree on. The Correspondent is entirely made out of letters. Letters that our narrator, Sybil, is writing and sending out to people in her life. Every character and every event in this book is introduced to the reader by these letters, which means that there is a lot of telling in this book and not much showing. This should give you a general idea of what kind of writing we are going to face in this book. But we're not going to stop here. We are going to go deeper and we're going to analyze this book. We're going to basically discuss what works in this book and what doesn't. This is going to be a spoiler-free review, so if you're interested in hearing my opinions, stick around. If book content and book reviews is something that you're interested in, please consider subscribing to my channel so that you wouldn't miss the future videos. Now, without further ado, let's wrap ourselves in this book that is called The Correspondent. Our narrator in this book is named Sybil von Antwerp. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name right. This is probably the last time I'm going to say it anyways. So Sybil is a senior lady. She's a mother, she's divorced, she's living single by herself at the moment, and she's a former law clerk. Almost every day, Sybil sits at her desk to write letters. She writes to her friends, acquaintances, neighbors, family members, and so on. The practice of writing letters is her favorite way of communicating with people in her life, which takes place over a course of 7 to 8 years in this book. She also writes letters to an anonymous person, but she never sends them out. Also, every now and then, she receives threatening letters from another anonymous person. So there is a level of mystery to this book. We also learn in the beginning of the book that Sybil has started losing her eyesight at the age of 73, which means pretty soon she might not be able to live alone or even continue writing letters, the activity that she really enjoys and she has been doing for a very long time. So what we learn about Sybil right from the start is that she has a special way, a special habit of living her life. She's organized and she likes order. She likes things done a certain way. She's not much for socialization with people other than writing them letters. However, we do get to see her meet a couple of people throughout the story. Sybil and her brother Felix were both adopted as children. Sybil became fascinated with letters when her adopted parents gave her a letter written by her birth mom, which made her take the pen and start writing letters in the first place. Sybil's brother Felix lives in Paris with his husband. Her daughter Fiona lives with her husband in London, and she has a best friend named Rosalie who lives in States, but they don't get to meet in person. They also communicate with each other via letters. Sybil is not the biggest fan of traveling. Later throughout the story, we understand why. Sybil, I would say, is kind of an unlikable narrator. She didn't bother me that much, aside from a couple of instances that I will get into later. But if you haven't read this book yet and you're planning to read it, just be aware that this is the kind of narrator that you're going to deal with in this book. She's strict, opinionated, and judgmental. She doesn't come off as evil, but she doesn't particularly come across as a sympathetic character as well. There is not one single line of dialogue in this book. Everything is basically narrated to you by Sybil. All of the letters have addresses and dates on top of them. Most of them are in chronological order, but some of them aren't. When Sybil is writing to others, you have the name of the recipient in the beginning of the letter. But when other people are writing to her, you don't get to read their name until basically the end of the letter where they sign their names. I actually wasn't the biggest fan of this format. I found it to be more like a memory game than anything else, and I'm a reader who pays close attention. But I had difficulty at some points of the book guessing whose letter is it that I'm reading. It doesn't help that almost all of the letters have the same writing style and the same tone. Sybil has impeccable penmanship. She's been writing for a long time. She's an avid reader, so I can accept that she writes really well. But then again, so does everybody else in her life. I honestly couldn't differentiate much between her letters and other people who were writing to her. They all kind of blended in together. They all had the same tone, which made me aware that I was actually reading the author's writing and not the characters. Sybil also writes letters to some of her favorite authors in this book because she likes to read and she likes to share her opinions on the books that she's currently reading. I also wasn't a big fan of this. To me, it came across as a bit pretentious and it didn't really do anything for the story. We understand throughout the book that Sybil has a strained relationship with her family, especially with her daughter Fiona. They don't get along. There is a gap between them that has deepened with years of miscommunication and avoidance. This is realistic because I think this relationship dynamic happens more with daughters and their mothers than with their sons. Mothers usually tend to project themselves onto their daughters. This creates unrealistic expectation, which then results in resentment from the daughter's part. I could feel that Sybil was projecting onto her daughter, so I could understand why their relationship was at the state that it was. Everything Fiona says to Sybil, whether advice or a complaint, is not received well by her. Now, does Sybil actually do enough to mend her relationship with her daughter? I would say no. Sybil is rigid. She is an older lady set in her ways. She's not much for change. She doesn't actually believe that she needs to change because she likes her ways. She likes things done a certain way. And by that certain way, I mean her way. And when that doesn't happen, she becomes defensive. She's not much for taking accountability either. This does happen with older age. And while I found it to be realistic, I didn't think it necessarily helped in creating a more sympathetic character. I'm saying this because I think it's important to emphasize on this point, that this is the kind of narrator you're going to deal with in this book. Realistic, yes. Sympathetic and likable, not so much. We understand throughout the story that she's suffering from a long-term grief, which can explain some of her behavior, but not all of it. There were definitely better ways for Sybil to deal with her pain and grief, but that's not the route that she takes. Regarding grief and trauma, I need to say that there is a lot of it in this book. And I mean a lot. Every single character you meet in this book has some sort of a trauma, either in their past or in their present life. There is terminal illness, mental illness, death, fertility issues, loss of a child. Name a trauma, any trauma, and you will probably read about it in this book. I actually found this to be unrealistic and a bit over the top. We don't need every character in a book to have a trauma or a disease or some kind of a serious problem in their lives. It made the story feel bleak. I found them to be unnecessary, like they were only there for the sake of creating trauma. The worst of them, I would say, is about the death of a cat. Sybil has a neighbor named Theodore, who's actually a very nice guy, and he kind of has a crush on her. Sybil, in a very strange scene, runs over Theodore's cat with her car. The book suggests that it happened because the cat went under the car. But because Sybil has a difficult time accepting losing her eyesight, I would call her an unreliable narrator at this point. Anyway, this happens. The neighbor comes out and asks Sybil to get him some towels. And Sybil's first thought is, I'm not going to go to my house to use some of my towels because they're too nice and too expensive. And I was like, well, thank you for showing absolutely zero sympathy. That was really strange to me because it felt like the author was just looking for a way to put Sybil inside this man's house and she couldn't think of anything else. It gets even weirder because when she goes to Theodore's house to get the towels, she gives us a full description of his house. She notices what kind of books he has, how many books he has. She notices his family photos, even the details on his family photos. When I was reading the scene, I kept thinking to myself, well, there's a cat dying outside. Why are you noticing all of these small things about of his house? If that had been me, I would have a difficult time even finding the bathroom because I would be so devastated. But she notices all of these details and then later she writes about them in a letter to her best friend. This scene was completely unnecessary in my opinion. It wasn't connected to the story in any way. It did not change or alter the relationship between Sybil and Theodore in any way. It really felt like something that was just there for shock value, and I didn't like it at all. What is worse is that Sybil shows absolutely no remorse for this incident. No apologies to Theodore, no sending out cards, flowers, or even a lame letter of apology, which we all know she likes to write. She doesn't even acknowledge that this ever happened. And Theodore, I don't know, I think because he's a nice guy, he doesn't also mention it ever again. Not only it didn't have an impact on the story at all, it definitely didn't help make Sybil's character a more sympathetic or likable person. Some of Sybil's correspondence I found to be unnecessary in this book, like the letters to famous authors, as I said, to a dean at a college, to her garden club, and to an acquaintance named Bassem, who was a Syrian immigrant working at customer service. Also to a teenage boy named Harry. Now, Harry is Sybil's former co-worker's son. He's, I think, obviously autistic and is one of the few people that Sybil is nice to throughout this book. I understand why Harry was in the book. I understand his function as a character. I know that he was connected to the DNA storyline. It's just that I found the DNA storyline to be irrelevant. There is a DNA subplot in this book with Sybil because we know that she was adopted as a child. Sybil already has a family that she doesn't get along with, and I would have very much liked to see her mend her relationship with her current family members rather than reading about her following some, lineage bloodline from her old family. Reading from Sybil's point of view is very much like being stuck in a room with a person who constantly monologues. That can be good. The thing is, the person that you're listening to monologuing has to be very, very interesting. To me, Sybil wasn't interesting enough. Aside from the mystery letters that she writes but never sends out and the threatening letters that she receives, there is no other mystery to the story. Even those turn out to be a letdown. Sybil's life in the end turned out to be pretty normal. Her secrets, not that interesting. I think this would have been a much better story if the author had made Sybil a more eccentric character. For example, if she was a woman who hadn't left her house for years, who had very severe social anxiety that she couldn't even step foot out of her door, I think she would be a more interesting character. The fact that she still has a normal life, she still visits her family members sometimes, she still goes on dates, made her a more normal person. And I don't think this was in her favor. If you're going to get stuck in the head of a narrator for all the book, it better be a fascinating character. The Diary of a Murderer, for example, I think does a similar thing much better. In that book, you're also stuck in a narrator's head, but your narrator is a former serial killer who is developing Alzheimer's disease. How fascinating is that? That is gold. That creates real suspense and tension. This sort of character is interesting enough, is fascinating enough to keep you going. I would have very much to read about an unreliable narrator with dark secrets and a dark past that we were going to unravel via these letters. Even Sybil's gradual blindness doesn't create suspense or tension. The tension is set up, but it's not paid off. In the end, it seems like this book is kind of a slice of a life story, with a redemption arc in the end. This is the second book I read in a row where redemption is given to the character via letters. And this is one of my least favorite tropes. I don't like where conflicts and issues in books are resolved by letters only. That just really doesn't cut it for me. I mean, how would you even know this person is genuine just by reading their letters? How would you know they have truly changed if you haven't witnessed this change? It seems unearned and impersonal, and it's not something that I like to read about. I understand why a lot of people like this book. The idea of writing letters, which is a lost art or lost craft. People like this because there is a level of nostalgia to this. It is for the same reason that a lot of people, for example, find The Midnight Library a good book. The power of books, the power of writing is something that a lot of readers find intriguing. The idea of a book entirely made out of letters might seem profound on first glance, but it is really having a character going through almost a decade of their life being passive and avoidant. This book has great writing, though, I give it that. It is what kept me going. The writing is polished, it's sophisticated, it has a good flow. It basically reads well, even though I would say it doesn't have a plot at all. This book is about 300 pages long, and I would say that it's about 100 pages too long. I think this would have been a better book if it was cut short. There are a couple of heartfelt moments in this book, for example, with Sybil's ex-husband letter that I found to be very nice. But what actually happens to the character of Sybil in this book is really not what I was hoping to read about. Okay, so that's a wrap for today. That was The Correspondent by Virginia Evans. Have you read this book? Write your opinions down in the comments for me. Please like this video if you liked this video. I'll be back in the future with more book reviews. Until then, farewell.